clap my hands up. Good afternoon, brother. Over to Shaka.
Glad to be here, brother.
Welcome to our story. And as you know, this series is dealing with the centralization of Africa in world history. And I've begun this series by asking each of our guests, first of all, to kind of identify themselves and tell us a little bit about them, a little bit about their background and how they came to be who they are in the sense of their standing in their research.
Well, my background is that I come out of the civil rights movement in 1960. I was a member of the Congress of Racial Equality from 1960 to 1966. I was chair of the San Francisco chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality between 1963 and 1965, and during that time led the largest northern civil rights movement in the United States, where we put 10,000 people in the streets and we defeated 676 employers for jobs, including the Bank of America, the largest bank in the world, which was a campaign that I led, which was a statewide campaign, and defeated them and opened up jobs for blacks and people of color. In 1964, I became head of the nationalist wing of the Congress of Racial Equality. Malcolm X had predicted that black nationalism would rear its head in the Congress of Racial Equality, in SNCC, and in other civil rights organizations. So I led the black nationalist forces in the Congress of Racial Equality, as Kwame Ture and others did inside of SNCC. In 1965, under my leadership, we took over the National Core Convention, voted white money out, and generally restructured CORE along black nationalist lines. I was then following the teachings of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, who was my first master. In 1966, along with a number of community leaders and organizations, we formed the Afro-American Institute that in 1970 became the Pan-African Peoples Organization, which I'm still a member of and chair. And we've operated an independent black school that's been in operation since 1973, African Children's Advanced Learning Center. Fed thousands of our people food for 25 cents a meal, which my wife, Anasa Shaka, headed. And have fought police violence, have been major organizers of African liberation support, mobilizing as many as 15,000 people in the Bay Area. Have worked in Ujamaa villages in Tanzania for months, where Dr. Julius Nyerere was then president, and was political chairman of the North American delegation for the 6th Pan-African Congress. I'm currently national vice chair of the Black United Front, in charge of organizing and training, which has been in operation since 1980, formed in Brooklyn, New York, where your show is aired. I'm also a scholar. I've been a scholar for 39 years as I've been an activist. My scholarship comes out of activism. It's a result of being involved in our people's movement, and coming out of that, the people taught me many lessons, and one was who I am as an African and who my enemies are. And they also taught me that I need to go back and do my homework, because the Western education had made me largely useless to my people. So the struggle, both going into conflict with white supremacy and everyday black people, encouraged me to hit the books, and people like Malcolm X and others, who became my second master. And so over a course of 39 years, I've been engaged in historical study. I have mastery in ancient African history, African American history, African philosophy, African American popular culture, especially our music, African leadership and governance systems, and I'm currently working on a book on African mastery systems that reveal how African people have achieved mastery in all walks of life where we have achieved mastery, and African family paradigms. My book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is a book that deals with African family models, or the model for African families, which before now hasn't been understood. I've written 4 books. The first is The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, which is the first book written by a black author on Malcolm's political thoughts. Most people don't know it, but Alex Haley was forced by the CIA and by the government to exclude 3 chapters on Malcolm. And in fact, Betty Shabazz, when she appeared in the Hunters Point in 1966 as a part of the Black Panther Party rally, it's a historic event because Huey and other members of the Panthers met her at the airport with guns, and this became like national news. I had met with Eldridge Cleaver in my house the previous week, and Eldridge wanted me to take part in this rally. And when Betty spoke, Betty said that the FBI and the CIA had forced Alex Haley to exclude 3 chapters from his book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. When Alex Haley died, a wealthy African American purchased his manuscript, and lo and behold, there were 3 chapters in that manuscript that did not appear in the autobiography: the social legacy of Malcolm X, the political legacy of Malcolm X, and the economic legacy of Malcolm X. So I knew this when I wrote the book, and the book is a look at Malcolm's political, spiritual, economic, and social orientation, as well as his international outlook. And it's a book that looks at Malcolm through Malcolm's eyes. So that was my first book, and Malcolm was my second master. My next 2 books came out in 1990. Malcolm came out in 1983. It's been since republished, and it's still on the market. My next 2 books were The Art of Leadership Volume 1 that came out in 1990, Volume 2 in 1991. And these books are used in black seminaries, they're used in black studies departments, they're used in rites of passage programs, they're used by black youth and black adults. These are the only books in the world that deal with African and African American leadership systems, philosophies, and traditions, strategies, and tactics. This is not a book about great black leaders. This is a book about what is leadership in the African American context. The first volume is dealing with definitions of leadership, qualities of leadership, the state of our community, what can we do to improve it? How can we take cliques in black organizations and manage them? And how can we build economic programs in our community and also our own schools? The second volume, Volume 2, the first chapter, Chapter 11, is Free the Mind. And it's then, at the time I wrote the book, 30 years of experience in de-brainwashing black folks following Frantz Fanon's paths of consciousness described in Wretched of the Earth, in which he moves from assimilation to disturbance to black nationalism. This is a path that Africans who are brainwashed, and we've all been brainwashed in this society, have to go through. The Volume 2 also covers the basis of the black church and the way in which Judaism and Islam and Christianity were influenced by the mystery systems of Kemet. And then there's a major chapter on low-intensity operations, which explains the most sophisticated methods the government's using now to disrupt our organizations, and most blacks don't know about it. The book that I completed in 1994, the end of 1994, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is a major work. It's the most important work I've ever done, and it is designed to look at what were the basis, or what was the basis of the just societies of ancient Africa, and in what way did the worldview of African people or philosophies affect these just societies, and what was the connection between African American popular culture and classical culture, blues, spiritual, rhythm and blues, rap, black classical music, literature, art, science, leadership traditions, family tradition. How did this tie into African philosophy? And I show that they are both the same. And then, what's the basis for African families? I look at 14 ancient and traditional African family systems. Dr. Asa Hilliard, in reviewing the book, said it was the best empirical study done on family systems that he's read. And in there, I discover a paradigm or model for our families. I don't invent it, I discovered it. And it's the secret for us getting our act together, because everybody's progress in the world is based on them following the pattern of their family model. The way the family is run is the way the nation is run when you're following your own family model. This book also looks at what's happened to us since the late 60s. Why has our culture and our families undergone more erosion between 1968 and 1999 than between 1619 and 1968? Then the last two chapters, because this book is half paradigm, half model for just societies, and half application to how do we apply this to today, because I'm an organizer and a scholar. So I'm interested in theory that walks. In other words, it's got to be practical. And so the last two chapters look at how does the family model and the worldview or philosophy of African people, how can it be used to revitalize African American families and extended families today? How can it be used to strengthen our communities and organizations? And in the last chapter, I look at how can this family model, philosophy, and worldview be used to build governance systems in the African continent. This chapter is 100 pages long, that will enable Africans to control their own minds and their own resources. And again, the family model provides the basis for this. I'm a tenured full professor at San Francisco State, where I've taught now for 27 years, where I also chaired Black Studies for 12 years. San Francisco State is the mothership of Black Studies in the United States. We are also right now the leading African-centered Black Studies department in the United States. They have attacked Leonard Jeffries' department at City College of New York and destroyed it. They've disrupted temples, and they're doing their best to undermine the Center for Inner City Studies, where many of our great scholars are, such as Jacob Carruthers and Anderson Thompson. They tried to destroy us, and they did not succeed, because we know how to fight as well as write. And as a consequence, we're able to bring Dr. Theophile Obenga in, and he's guiding us to the next level. We're getting ready to offer a joint PhD program with UC Berkeley and hopefully Temple. We base our discipline on African philosophy. We're the only Black Studies department in the country that does. We're now also preparing a master's program centered around African philosophy, ancient African history, and African American history. So in a nutshell, I'm a scholar and an activist, and my scholarship drives my activism, but my activism drives my scholarship.
Thank you. Professor OBA Shaka, I'd like to ask you, in relationship to the name of this program, the centralization of Africa in world history, if you agree with the premise, and if you do, why?
Sure. African people gave birth to humanity 3.5 million years ago, technically, with Lucy, who wasn't a human, but was the first human ancestor, and with the birth of Homo sapiens sapien 30 to 40,000 years ago. So all human beings have their origin in Africa. Therefore, also, human history has its origin in Africa, because all human beings make history, and African people were the first to make history. We gave birth to the world's first people, the Twa, who laid down many things for the world, including family, economic, spiritual, educational, social systems. We have the world's first civilization, which was Kush, or Ethiopia. So that's the mother civilization of the world. And interestingly enough, some of the Roman historians linked the origin of Ethiopia to the Twa, particularly to Bes, who was the first ancestor of the Kemites, the Egyptians, who was also Twa. And we know that Ethiopia gave birth to Kemet, or some call it Nubia, or Tasseti. These were names given to it by the Kemites. They called it Tasseti, people of the bow. The Greeks called it Ethiopia, which meant people of burnt faces, which was, of course, an outsider's view. The Ethiopians, according to William Leo Hansberry, in ancient Africa, as seen by classical scholars, he notes that the term that the people of Ethiopia used to call themselves was Quevs, Q-U-E-V-S, or Kesh, K-E-S-H. The biblical term is Cush. And so we can see the biblical term is very close to the term used by the Ethiopians themselves. So when we look at Cush or Kesh, we see that it gave birth to Kemet, and Kemet is the greatest achievement in ancient classical civilization. And then we see that the civilizations that developed in West Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Canaan, Bornu, in East Africa, Zimbabwe, the Congo, and many other civilizations, that these are mother civilizations and central civilizations to the world. We also understand that if we look at the role of Africans in world history, Hannibal's role in world history was fundamental importance. He interacted with the Roman world in the Second Punic War and won every battle on the Roman Peninsula, was perhaps, if not the greatest military strategist, one of the greatest strategists in the world. So, as John Henry Clarke often pointed out, it was the fall of Carthage that really reflected the decline of Africans, but it was Hannibal's role in the Second Punic War that once again indicated the impact of Africans on world history. And we also know the African presence in Spain through the Moors was very important, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, Africans conquered Spain under Tariq bin Ziyad, and from 711 AD to 1491, Africans ruled Spain, along with Arabs, and introduced back into Europe the light of civilization. So the golden age of Spain was the Moors. Ivan van Sertima has done a fine job in one of his Journal of African Civilizations that he devotes exclusively to the Moors in Spain, showing that the Berbers, who were Moors, come from North Africa. Many Europeans try and say these Berbers were white. Well, the Berbers had a white group and a black group. And what Dr. Ivan van Sertima's research and other authors who wrote in this Journal of African Civilization issue clearly show is the Berbers who founded the Moorish Empire in Spain, they were black. And then we can see the African presence in America, the Olmec civilization. And the Olmec really lay the foundation for the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas. The Olmecs provide building and step pyramids. The Olmecs, through their great facial carvings that we see that are tons in weight found all over Mesoamerica, clearly indicate that they're black, though this was not an exclusively black civilization. It was African and Native American, but it was African-led. If you study the philosophy of the Aztec people, or the Mayan people, or the Toltec people, you'll see that the worldviews of these Native American people are very similar to the worldview of African people. So there's not only a centralization of Africans in world history, there's a common cultural unity that you'll see coming out of Africa that impacts not only Native Americans in America, but the Chinese in China and the Indians in India. There's a great deal of similarity in their cultures and ours, though each of them have developed their own special national culture. In the beginning, the world began out of Africa and African people. So there is a strong strand of cultural unity, even though there's also a great deal of cultural difference, and that's what makes the world great. So Africans have been underestimated in history because Hegel, particularly a German philosopher and historian, began the project of writing Africans out of history by saying that we were savage and uncivilized, by saying that Egypt did not belong to the spirit of Africa, that it was a part of Asia, by saying that North Africa belonged to Europe, therefore appropriating Carthage and Hannibal to Europe. Many times you'll see European history books on the Carthaginians or Hannibal Barcar, who was Hannibal's father, who was also a great general. They've turned them white. As one of my former students said, those who are in control of the present have the ability to distort the past. And that's exactly what we've seen in the European project to write Africans out of history. So when Hegel approached what he called dark Africa, West, Central, East, and South Africa, he said that was a land of savages. He said that not only did these people not have a history, he said these people weren't even humans. He said, let us have no sympathy for these people. So in fact, what Hegel did is carry out a genocide in the teaching of history. That is, he created a historicide. There was a basis for the menticide that Bobby Wright talks about in the school system that is the basis for genocide that was carried out through the slave trade with 100 million Africans, according to Du Bois in his book, Suppression of the African Slave Trade, dying in the Middle Passage, and countless millions of others dying since then. And the same attitude we see expressed in Jasper County in Texas, where a brother is dragged to his death until his body falls apart. It's an attitude that Europeans have had, that we aren't human. And so the centralization of Africans in world history is important for understanding that we gave birth to humanity. If that's so, and it is, clearly that's agreed by anthropologists, paleontologists, and everyone else, then there can't be any superior or inferior races. If there's a centralization of Africans in world history, then that means that without Africa, there'd be no human race. If there's a centralization of Africans in world history, then we cannot understand the foundation of world civilization and world culture until we understand the mind, the spirit, and the soul of Africa.
We're going to talk about that. I want to come back to that for a moment, but I think it would be important. I'd like to get this out of the way now. And you were defining for me yesterday, or interpreting European philosophy in the sense that their spiritual worldview goes back to a Greek kind of understanding symbolism, or understanding how the world came into being and so forth. But I think it's very important for us to lay that down, and we'll drop back to that later, but I want to lay it down at the beginning and come back. And I know you don't want to deal with Europeans, but just do that one for me.
Yes, see, I knew he had this smile on his face when he asked this question, because I told him I'm not interested in wasting a lot of time on Europe. See, we got to really look at who we are and where we're going. I'm a warrior, and I'm about being a part of the process of defeating Western oppression and Western supremacy, but I will deal with this briefly. The European mind, if you want to call it that, has its origin, in particularly the European worldview or philosophy, in a little-known European thinker. When I say little known, he's not given much prominence in the West because in some ways they're ashamed of him. His name was Hesiod. He was a Greek sheep herder, and he was a poet. He was illiterate. And he gave voice to what was popular thought in the Greek world at that time. And the themes that he lays down in his book, The Theogony, and also Works and Days, lay down the themes of the Western worldview. Plato pretty much operates on those themes and embellishes them. Hegel draws from these themes and also draws from Plato. And Descartes and many of the other prominent Western thinkers, because we need to understand the genocide against Africans began in the minds of Europeans. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of Hesiod in his Theogony has this idea of heaven in which the gods and goddesses are in conflict. And the male gods and the female goddesses war with each other. And in most cases, the female goddesses went out, suggesting that there was conflict in Greek society and that women were oppressed by men, which was true. But also it's a theme of Western thought of conflict between male and female and masculine and feminine. And it's a disharmony that's fundamental to the Western worldview. It runs from Hesiod through the psychologists Freud, to, just about all of their modern and ancient philosophers. So in his theogony, what he describes is the battles that occur between male gods and female goddesses, between their sons and daughters who sleep with each other, and then the daughters end up killing the sons. In the case of Zeus, who is the supreme god in Greek thought, Zeus dethrones his father. So another principle that comes out of this is not just masculine-feminine conflict, but conflict. The notion that things that are different, male, female, masculine, feminine, are in conflict more than they're in harmony. That's a Western worldview, that opposites run things. Whether it's Marxism or capitalism, it doesn't matter the ism, you'll see that this notion of conflict is central in the Western worldview. In Hesiod's theogony, Zeus is a god who has arbitrary power. Zeus wills to destroy man, the race of man, which means men and women. Zeus creates all kinds of problems for the gods, but because the gods are immortal, he cannot destroy them. This is another theme in the African worldview, that those who rule for one reason, because they have power. They may clean it up and talk about truth and justice and freedom, but in the end, what they're really talking about is that whoever has the power rules. And in the Western world, they respect one thing, and that's power. Doesn't matter whether you're a Marxist or a capitalist, power is the ultimate thing that's respected in the Western world. So that what we see then is with Hesiod, he's laying down some basic things. Dr. Jacob Carruthers, who is one of our best thinkers, he makes the point that Hesiod creates the work ethic. And it's interesting because in Hesiod's theogony, man exists before woman. Now this is really a problem. How can man exist without woman? But it's kind of like the Greek mind is saying the best world would be a world with no women in it. Now the black man would have trouble with that notion. That would be like the world with no sunshine in it.
That's right.
You know? It would be just a dark and cloudy day. Not to put down darkness, because darkness is beautiful, but a man with no woman, that's just inconceivable.
That's right.
And of course, it's biologically impossible. But according to Hesiod and his theogony, and this was Greek belief, Zeus creates woman as a plague on man. See, again, conflict, male-female. And he creates Pandora. And there's this old saying, most of you have heard of this Pandora's box. You don't really know what it means. The box is, of course, the sexual equipment of the woman. And so Zeus describes in Hesiod the creation of Pandora as a beautiful, well-shaped woman who they use with the B word. And the B word starts with Hesiod. Of course, it starts with the Greeks. And anytime you see a brother using the B word against a sister, you need to know where that mentality came from. It came from the mind of the oppressor. Same mind that led to our genocide. Because if you call the woman who gave birth to humanity a B, what does that make you? So the thing is, Hesiod then lays down this theme of conflict again between male and female, but here's the key thing. Before woman came along, man didn't have to work. But he says, woman is good at taking the rich man's wealth, but doesn't do anything to help the man who's poor get out of poverty. And so man is inspired to work, to compete with his neighbor, to take care of his woman who's a woe unto him. So the work ethic, and Jacob Carruthers is the one that really deserves the insight for this. He makes the point that under both capitalism and Marxism, they both extol and praise the work ethic. Everyone should work, But under the capitalist system, an old black man told me once, I was down in the Fillmore in San Francisco, and he came up to me and he says, you know what, young man? I said, what? He said, you never make money working. If you think about it, the people who make money don't work. The people who run the system, the Rockefellers and the rest of them, they don't work. But they got us working awful hard. And the biggest reason a lot of us work is we think we too can become a Rockefeller. Biggest joke on the planet. So Zeus concealed from man the truth that man does not need to work day and night, that he could just work a couple of days out of the week and take care of his needs. But he was tricked into work. And the same thing with the Marxists. The Marxists extol the worker, but the people who run Marxist societies don't work. The same thing with the aristocrats of Europe. They extol work, but they were the laziest people you could lay your eyes on. So what you see right here is fundamental parts of the Western worldview. Plato takes those up. He accepts this notion that man is in conflict with woman, and he creates a hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, it's reason that's placed on the highest throne. And that is associated with the masculine and with the male, but particularly elite males, the philosopher kings. They believe to be the ones that can reason. The United States accepts this proposition. When the Constitution was written in secrecy, you had a group of elite white males, very smart white males, who in conspiracy got together and created the Constitution of the United States, who believed that the masses could not reason. And it was their job to reason for them. And in fact, Madison, one of the so-called founding fathers of the United States, wrote the Federalist Papers, one of the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution. He explained why they met in secrecy and why they were setting up a republic. He said the role of Republican government is to control the people. And then he said it is to control itself. And what's usually left out of most quotes on Madison's statement is what he said to follow. In my book, The Mother Principle, notes this along with many other things. Return to the African Mother Principle of male and female equality. And what it notes is that Madison said the fundamental reason why Republican government, Republican government is what you have here. They call it a democracy, but it's a few people you elect who represent the interests of a fewer people who run the country, and that's the moneyed interests that run the Congress and the Senate and the local and state governments. And what he said is the fundamental reason why Republican government is created to control the people, because if the people get control of the government, they will equitably distribute the wealth, and they will not pay usurious debts. They won't pay debts with high interest. He said they won't pay debts, but we know they all had high interest on it, and that's what they wouldn't pay. So what you need to understand is Plato's mind played a big part in setting up this system and conned a whole lot of us into thinking that this is about freedom, justice, and equality. A point I didn't point out is Hesiod creates this notion that Zeus is free. And freedom in the Western world means the right of the white man, and particularly the elite whites, to do whatever they want to do. That's what freedom means in the Western world. That's why they could talk about freedom, justice, and equality as the motive for the American Revolution. And as soon as it was over, enslave blacks and exterminate Native Americans, because what freedom meant was the freedom of the white man to do whatever he thought was in his interest. So Plato deifies reason, and he puts reason on the supreme throne, and he says only the elite have reason. The masses don't have it, the workers don't have it, women don't have it, strangers don't have it. Now what I didn't say about Hegel is, a central trap of Hegel's thinking is that Hegel deifies reason. He takes Plato's idea and he takes it and says that reason rules nature. Reason rules the world. Reason rules the cosmos. He also said God is reason. And then he also asserted that only the white man really had reason, that Africans didn't have reason. And he used reason to construct a view of the world in which he ruled Africans out of humanity, denied that Indians in India had really made a history because they didn't keep a record of it, as if whether you keep a record of it has anything to do with whether you made history. Some people have a better memory of their history through their oral memory than some do of their written history, because the oral history is often required in most societies of color to be accurate. And then he said the Chinese didn't have history because what they tended to do was issue moral edicts and things like that, but they did not have a rule of law. They didn't have the system that the Europeans had. So Hegel uses reason to rule
people out of humanity and out of history, and reason is used as the basis for conquest. There's a Native American thinker, he's become an actor recently, Russell Means, who was a leader in the American Indian movement. He gave a speech called Fighting Words on the Future of the Earth. It was in Mother Jones about 10 years ago, and it was a very profound thing. And one of the things he said was, reason was a curse. And what he meant was, he said the fox knows his enemy, but the European, operating purely on reason, denying intuition, denying spirituality, has less sense than a fox. So, in a nutshell, there's much more to the Western worldview, but this is the essence of it. It is a worldview in which reason is deified and intuition and spirituality is suspect. It's not only suspect, it's treated as a superstition, in which power is the fundamental thing, in which conquest and control becomes the motive force of Western man. There was a European historian, his name was Oswald Spengler. He wrote Decline of the West, Volume 1 and Volume 2, Hour of Decision, Man and the Techniques. And in Decline of the West, he makes some very fundamental points. And one of the most fundamental points is, he says, Western man is the only man that had the desire to conquer the world and then proceeded to do it. Their philosophy dictated it. So if we're to understand a people, we better understand their worldview. As Dr. Carruthers said, the Europeans really don't have a worldview. They have a ethnocentric view. They have a view of themselves which they've tried to impose on the world. But if we're to understand how they could engage in a destruction process, such as the one they've carried out against the world, then we have to understand their mind.
Thank you very much. With that, I'd like for us to look back and begin to look at the first people, the first Homo sapiens sapiens. We're talking about Africa as the centralization of world history. You talked about the Twa as being the first Homo sapiens sapien that brought civilization and thought and principles and organization, etc., to the world. Tell us about it. Tell us all about the Twa.
Okay, one of the things that I'm pointing out in the mother principle, return to the African mother principle of male and female equality, is that I look at Dr. Cheikhana Diop's central premise, and it is that if we're to understand the greatness of ancient African civilization, then we must understand the greatness of ancient Kemet. And he says, for Kemet is to Africa as Greece was to Europe. That for Europeans, while the Greeks themselves drew much from Kemet and from Africa, that Western civilization can't really be understood without understanding its Greek connection. Now, the mother principle accepts this. You know, I recognize that Diop is perfectly correct, that ancient Kemet is the highest achievement in art and science and mathematics and literature, in medicine, in astronomy, in the various sciences and social sciences. They built the greatest architectural structures the world has ever seen. And we need to understand that, because it indicates the achievements that we did yesterday make it possible for even greater things that we can do today and tomorrow. Garvey made this point. It's true. The mother principle asserts, though, that while Dr. Cheikhana Diop is correct, that just as it's important to understand the centrality of Kemet to African history, for you can't understand the greatness of ancient African history unless you understand the greatness of ancient Kemet, it is equally important that we understand the centrality of the people who gave birth to the foundation of civilization. Just as it's important to understand the 12th story of any building, it's even more important to understand its foundation, because without the foundation, there would be no structure. And so the mother principle asserts that just as Kemet is central to understanding the greatness of ancient African civilization, the Twa are central in understanding the justness of African civilization. The Twa are essential in understanding the basis of African family formation, of which we know very little about in ancient Kemet, other than the families of royal families. The Twa are essential in understanding the governance systems of African societies, not only in the past, but today. The Twa are essential in understanding the spiritual, the initiatory systems, and what has been called the mystery systems. The Twa are also, because we're a musical people, though we're not just musical, but as Malcolm points out, music is mathematics. And there's a reason why brothers carry boom boxes around, because we like to have our music with us wherever we go. The Twa give birth to this notion of music, and music being spiritual. The Twa also give birth. Twa not only give birth to musical systems, they give birth to the oral tradition. And even in societies that gave birth to writing, such as ancient Ethiopia or Keb, and took writing to a high standard in ancient Kemet, the oral always was primary. The Twa give birth to the highest ethical standards in the world, and there's a secret reason why Africans, even at a time in which we're off balance and we've fallen far from the greatness we had achieved in classical antiquity, Africans are still the most honest people on the planet. So in a world that's unjust, as Malcolm X said, is as crooked as a pretzel, we need more than anything models of justice, because we come from a people that are extremely just, and we're out of harmony because we're walking out of our just path. We're walking in shoes that don't fit us anymore. We're behaving out of culture. We're doing things we never even conceived of doing before. So what is it that the Twa contributed? The mother principle, you know, Dr. Obenga makes a very profound point. He says that African philosophy is based on hypothesis. The European comes up with a theory, and then they, you know, eliminate or accept that theory based on trial and error. European science is based on hypotheses. Someone will come up with a theory and they'll say, the universe began with the Big Bang. And then they'll proceed to look at the cosmos and see whether or not that actually happened. African thought and African systems, as Dr. Obenga says, are based on precision. He makes the point that they're real, that Africans had an ability to come up with the truth right away, that it was not a hypothesis, a guess. We got right down to the heart of the truth. What does this have to do with the Twa? The mother principle, unlike most books, is not based on a hypothesis. And most of our people have trouble understanding this because we have been conditioned in the Western frame. If we're scholars, then we're supposed to have a hypothesis, and then we're supposed to test that hypothesis and then draw conclusions. The mother principle is based on a vision. The reason that Africans could be so precise and accurate was that we combined technical understanding of astronomy, of the stellar system, of chemistry, of mathematics, with an intuitive understanding, with a spiritual insight. And with these two, we were able to come up with a pyramid that sat dead center on the planet, that's still standing today. Stop. So, you know, the mother principle is based on a vision, and it's different from a hypothesis. And I believe that the reason that the ancient Africans were so accurate in their thought is that they weren't simply dealing with the logical mind alone. they were dealing also with the intuitive realm. And so they were combining logic with intuition. The mother principle is the result of what was then 32 years of careful research and careful work, in particular study of African philosophy, Dogon philosophy in particular, but also Kemetic, Asante, Yoruba, many other African philosophies, and African American philosophy, which we'll talk about later. And it was after writing the mother principle for a period of 1 month and writing 180 pages that I realized, sitting in my study one evening, that I really didn't understand the essence of what the Dogon meant by just societies. And you'll see here symbols of the Dogon. These are the Numo twins that reflect the union of the masculine and feminine principle. And you can see here, there is a female, and she has a beard. Much like, or excuse me, a male who has a beard, but who has his chest extended like breasts, symbolic of the fact that there's the feminine principle within the masculine. And you have at the same time the female with the beard shaped the way the beard of a dead pharaoh is shaped, indicating that the authority for pharaohship or rulership came from the female. And you see the arm around the female indicating the cooperation of male and female. They're sitting on a slab which is the center of the sky. So it's saying that the masculine and feminine, male and female, are the central principles in the cosmos. And there are 4 females holding them up who are pregnant, representing north, south, east, and west, fire, earth, air, and water. And what's holding up the sky is the placenta, which is considered to be the masculine part of the feminine. So what we see here in a miniature is the philosophy of the Dogon. And it was through studying this philosophy that I began to write this book in 1990, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. And after writing it for a month, 180 pages, I came to understand that I understood pieces, but I didn't understand the whole. And it was when I asked myself, what did the Dogon mean by just societies? Because the Twa represent the basis for just societies. And note, I wasn't looking at the Twa, I was looking at the Dogon. And I got humbled because I realized I'd been in this system 32 years and I understood pieces of it. And an African system you have to internalize, you have to apply it to yourself. It's not just a regurgitation of information. It changes you because it's revealing principles that govern the cosmos. And to the extent that you're not in harmony with some of those principles, you have to work with them. So I've been working with the feminine principle a lot, which I'll talk about more later. And so it was when I got humbled and realized that I didn't understand the connection of this philosophy. I didn't understand how it tied together, that I began to ask some questions about what did the Dogon mean by just societies, that I had one of the most, in fact, the most beautiful experience of my life. When suddenly, when I got humble and asked the question, what did the Dogons mean by just society, I saw this beautiful light. Nothing spoke to me, but it was just a beautiful light, very peaceful. Many people describe heaven as light. Many have gone to the other side and come back because there are experiences of people who've died, their heart stopped beating, they come back to life. They experience those who are good people being embraced by the light. Some of them call this Jesus, others call this Buddha, some of them call this Muhammad, but it's love. And what I experienced was this beautiful, calm feeling. But instantly, the light revealed an answer. And this pointed me in the direction of the Twa, because that light said that the just societies of Africa were those where all the just males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And I knew instantly that was the Twa, the Batwa. What I didn't know at the time was the Dogon who I had been studying had displaced the Twa. So they had been influenced by the Twa. Though there are some things in their symbolism that's Kemetic, fundamentally, their system is a male-female, masculine-feminine, spiritual, material system. Very Twa-like. And so I was humbled. I knew the ancestors had given me something so simple that if I relied on the Hesiod, particularly Hegel, Plato, rational mind alone, I would have never got it, because the logical mind looks for complexity. Just societies have got to be elaborate. But just societies are just made up of males and females. And so what the vision said was that the just societies of Africa were those where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And so I stopped writing for 2 years, and I began to look at things differently. I knew it was accurate, but now I had to go and do my homework in a different way and throw those 180 pages in the garbage can. But it was a beautiful feeling, because as a warrior, I've been fighting for just society, as Africans have for hundreds of years in the United States and around the world. And the ancestors had given me a simple key, fundamental key. So what did this have to do with the Twa? Well, I knew this was the Twa, because among the Twa, there are no rich nor poor, no leaders nor followers, and no slaves. Everyone's free. I knew that. I said, Twa, that's them. And then I realized what the ancestors had given me. They gave me the foundation. They're the first people. But see, the ancients all understand. Europeans think first people most backward, cave-like, all this. Africans and Easterners understand first people are the ones closest to God. Therefore, they're the most just. And so I knew instantly that these Twa were fundamental to the development of African society. So as I began to examine them and study them, went to Ghana and discovered their role in terms of training great healers, and began to look at different African societies, but began to go back and look at the Twa, what I realized was, well, first, the Twa gave birth to this notion of balance in families between males and females. They create a system where men and women are equal but different. See, the African view of equality is different from the European one. We understand, yes, equally valued. Each is interdependent on the other, but different. Man is potential father, woman is potential mother. And there's honor in this. And so what we see is in Twa society, there's this notion of balance but difference. The Twa give birth to the notion that in African economy, the woman is in charge in the hunter-gatherer societies, because the Twa were one of the first economic systems. They created one of the first economic systems in the world, a hunter-gatherer system that precedes agriculture. And the men hunt, women gather. Now, they set the pattern for subsequent African economies, because as Africans become agricultural, women become the agriculturalists. Well, that's a step up from gathering, because you're gathering vegetables or wild foods that people can eat. And all agricultural is planting foods that people can eat. And so, again, the economy comes from the Twa. And throughout traditional Africa, and Dr. Diop noted this as well, men were hunters. They were also cattle tenders. And with the Twa, as hunters, particularly those with bows and arrows, they were defenders. So were some women. But that was fundamentally the line of males. So what we saw is that family economy comes from the Twa. To this day in Africa, Africans are being fed by African women who are the primary agriculturalists. And they have been pushed out of the global economy. And men have been marginalized and pushed into the cities to try and make money to take care of their families. The African man has been marginalized all over the world, meaning being pushed out of the family. And this is a recent phenomenon for Africans in the West. The African family model provided by the Twa is the key for getting our males back into the family, getting productive males that can begin to, again, contribute to the family unit. And I'll come to that later. So the thing is, the Twa gives birth to family systems. Because it's a system in which men and women have an equal say-so, the Twa give birth to the principle that the government are the people. Now, this is crucial. The West talks this talk, but they don't walk this walk. You know, a government by the people, for the people, and of the people. And we all know it's a government of money, for money, and through money. And it's a few rich white males that run this system. Right now, if you're looking at the contest for president, it's who has the most money that determines who will probably be elected to office. And if not the most, a lot. So the thing is, the Twa give birth to the notion that since the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society, therefore, the way in which decisions are made is not the majority ruling over the minority, but through consensus. The African way of decision making is consensus. Africa is in trouble today because you have military dictatorships using the gun to dictate to Africa. You have now, with this domination of the United States of the world economy, political parties, and in Nigeria they have a Republican and Democratic Party, you know, two animals, both of which, you know, run people who represent the same interests. What you find is that Africa is in a position where consensus is not the method for making decisions. It's a few dictating to the many. Not even the majority dictating to the minority, but that's not the African way. Because when you put everybody's ideas in the pot, and as an organizer, I've used consensus for 39 years, and it works. You just have to be patient. You have to take your time. You have to listen to people. You have to respect their views, and you really have to respect elders, because in African systems of consensus, and it starts with the Twa elders preside over the hunting band's decision. Everybody has a say-so. And in the end, it's the decision of the whole group, not the majority, but the whole group. So the Twa give birth to this. The Twa give birth to the highest ethical systems known in the world. Among the Twa, there are no rich and poor. A simple reason, because they give birth to communalism, to this notion of sharing. That if you're an elder, you were a hunter, you brought life into the world, so when the men hunt, they come back from the hunting band, the men are in charge of distributing the meat, but they must distribute it equitably. And they must use a complementary principle. So the male hunter will give the first piece of meat to the wife's family. You know? So the thing is, sharing comes through the Twa, but this high standard of honesty. There are no murderers among the Twa, no robbers. They're not perfect. When they do wrong, they're banned from the hunting band for a while. But they established the highest standards of ethics, and they didn't have to call it ethics. They lived this. One reason is they're the only people on the planet who have only one view of God, and that is that God's all good. Every African philosophy I've studied portrays God as positive and negative, not because the creators of that system believed that God was positive and negative, but because on the lower level, people only understand God based on their experience. So they will portray God as positive and negative, more positive than negative, because people couldn't understand something all good. The only people who can really understand something all good are pretty close to it themselves. And so the Twa have this notion of an absolutely good God and creator. And they established the stamp of Africans being spiritual. Because the Twa, everything is spiritual. The Twa were defined by the Greeks as the Gnomi people, G-N-O-M-E, the people of wisdom. And they also called them Gignoskians, the keeper of mysteries. The Twa are the initiators into the healing systems of the world. They're the greatest healers on the planet. When I was in Ghana in 1990, after I had this vision, I hooked up with Leonard and Rosalind Jeffries in Kumasi. Wade Nobles was also a part of their party. And one night we were in a hotel staying in Kumasi. Leonard Jeffries brought in the greatest healer in Ghana, an Asantewashi, Queen Mother. And I ran up to my room and got a tape recorder, went back down and taped what she had to say. Wade Nobles also taped her. And she told this story, and it was interesting because I had come to Ghana to find this, and here I am, accidentally, because Leonard didn't notify us that she was coming. I was just lucky to be in the hotel. And here's this woman who's going to bring me back to these little people. And so she says that she was born of a priest who was a father. And at 7 years and 7 months, she went to the river near the forest and disappeared for 7 months. Now later, a year later, a few years later, my wife and I went to Ghana and found this was common in Ghana. Today, right. And the mother thought she had been killed or kidnapped. The father knew what had happened. She had been taken into the forest by the little people, the Twa. And the Twa had initiated her into healing telepathically without ever talking to her. You also, brother, were telling me about a case, brother, you know, who said the same thing. And I've heard numerous other cases. Transmitting knowledge through the mind, the spirit mind, is the highest form of transmission. Most people in the world don't know how to do it. But because the Twa are the world's first people, they're in contact with the highest spiritual powers. These are good people because here they are initiating children who they see have potential into healing powers. They're receiving no pay for this. They have more skill than the greatest medical schools have. This sister has the power to go into a trance, and her spirit diagnoses a person's illness. And she has the special power to heal nervous disorder. We know about people who can heal with hands and different things. We have a power inside ourselves. All of us do. But the Twa know how to tap it. So they're the initiators of mystery systems that the Kemites talk about. That's why the Greeks referred to them as gignoskian, because they were the keeper of the mysteries, the highest knowledge. They give birth to the notion that the oral is primary. See, a lot of us are ashamed to say this because we're in a written culture, so we got to prove that we have writing. Well, we gave birth to writing. End of discussion. The Ethiopians were the first ones to write. They gave birth to the written system of Kemet. And there were many inter-African civilizations that wrote, but every one of them valued the spoken word above the written. Jacob Carruthers said that the language of ancient Kemet was a walking, talking, doing word because they wrote the way we speak. Black writers, see, because we be more African than we know, we most often write the way we speak. Toni Morrison's writings are driving and moving because she has this, what they call the orality in the literature. James Baldwin, the same thing. He wrote the way a preacher preaches because he came out of the Baptist church, you know. So the thing is, the Twa established this principle that the word is primary. And you see, the oral cultures of Africa, drawing from this, show us that the word is considered to be the thing that really connects man to God, because what separates us from all the animals is we speak. Now, animals have a way of communicating, and animals are wise, and we'd be well to know that because we could learn much from the animals. In fact, in this world where right is wrong and wrong is right, the animals are often smarter than the two-legged creatures, and it shouldn't be that way because the animals aren't just operating on reason. So the thing is, when we look at the Twa, they give birth to this notion that the word is a vital force, that the word, the Bambara, who are a kindred people to the Dogon, the Bambara teach that the Creator gave man and woman speech, and Creator made man and woman his interlocutor or representative on earth. And think about this. This is really heavy. That the role of the word is to maintain balance in the cosmos, on earth, between all creeping and crawling, all growing, animate and inanimate things and beings. This is heavy. In fact, the Bambara call the Creator Ma, M-A-A, Ngala, N-G-A-L-A. Now add one word to it, one letter to it, T, you would have Ma'at. Ma Ngala. That's the Creator. And then the Creator calls man and woman Ma. Think about it. And their definition of what it is to be a human being is to be kind and gentle. That's what a human being is. And the Twa are the kindest and most gentle human beings on the planet. You mess with them and you're in trouble. These little people have their poison arrows, and you know, we know all about hoodoo and voodoo from South Carolina and you know, from Louisiana. My wife comes from Bayou Fort Worth. They know all about that. Well, the Twa know more about it than anybody else, and people know, don't mess with these little people. But they are the most just people walking and talking. So if we're to understand the greatness of Kemet, all of the great achievements it made, the greatness of Ghana, of Mali, of Songhai, of Zimbabwe, of the great civilizations, we need to understand the foundation people that gave birth to this. In Kemet, the great ethical notion was ma'at. Harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order. Righteousness, uprightness, regularity, steadfastness. As Dr. Obenga likes to say, reality. Genuineness. See, it's much more than harmony, truth, balance, right order, and justice. It's much more. And the Kemites said that Ma'at was the order of heaven. They said that it was the rudder of heaven, the part of the ship that gives direction. In this case, the invisible direction of the cosmos is Ma'at. It follows harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order. That's why the Bambara would say a human being is kind and gentle. It's the way of the cosmos. To be warlike is to go against the cosmos. And then they said Ma'at is the beam of earth, the central part of a building, the foundation. Now, the Twa give birth to this in that they walked it. They talked it. They lived it. They didn't have to theorize it. And this is the thing to understand. When you create societies and have to create laws, such as Ma'at, it's an indication that the people in that society have departed from it. Therefore, they need the laws. The Twa practiced these principles, and they needed no formal formulation, codification in law books, because it was in their heart, it was in their speech, it was in their walk, it was in their talk. So the Twa give birth to this notion of justice and balance, and they set the standard for subsequent African societies. Now, what we see from the Twa, Dr. Chancellor Williams wrote two great works. One was Destruction of Black Civilization. The other was Rebirth of African Civilization. Rebirth was his greatest work. Most people haven't read it. Black Classics Press has reprinted it. You should get it. Read that book. Read both of them. But Rebirth was done in Ghana in the 50s under the supervision of Kwame Nkrumah. He allowed Dr. Chancellor Williams to come in and do his research. He interviewed thousands of Ghanaians on what would be the best form of government, the end of colonialism. And the conclusions he reached are very Twa-like, and I'll come back to them. But the thing is, in his book, Destruction of African Civilization, he said the birthplace of democracy were the classless age-grade societies. These are societies in which there are no chiefs or queens, that the people run them themselves and they have age grades. There are children who are in one group, and they basically play tin cattle. Then there are teenagers, they're in another group. They get initiated into manhood, and they take care of some responsibilities in the village. They are being prepared to become warriors. Then there's the age of warriorhood, who supervises the adolescents in their initiation. And they protect the society. They're also cattle tenders, and they're hunters. And then there's elders, and they're the ones that preside over the councils of the whole people. And they make recommendations, but all the males and females have the equal power to make the decision, which is Twa-based. Then you have the senior elders, and the senior elders become like the judicial officials. They preside over disputes where judgment is required, court cases. And then there are the elders from their 80s on, and they're usually retired because there's fear that they may become senile. But the point is, classless age-grade societies are governed through these age grades. The whole people have to say so in any village decision, but through going through these different classes, you have the opportunity to participate in every phase of the society. If you live long enough, and if you're just. So what we see is the Twa are the first, they're hunter-gatherer. What's really different about the classless age-grade societies is that they're agricultural. And so this is the beginning of agrarian societies. That's a step up or a step later from the hunter-gatherer societies. And by the way, hunter-gatherer societies still exist. There are Twa in the forest of Africa. There are Twa in the Kalahari Desert. Now, classless age-grade societies are also larger than the hunter-gatherer. The hunter-gatherer are smaller. Another thing I didn't say about the Twa give birth to the notion that the governance unit is an extended family, because Twa hunter-gatherer bands, hunting bands, are families. And what you'll find is, both in the classless age-grade societies and later in the kingly-queenly societies, what you have are extended family or lineage systems. We call ours extended family, but in Africa, the lineage is people from a common ancestor, common bloodline, real large, aunts, uncles, relatives, grandparents, parents, all of these, and they have elected officers. So it's a structure. It's the first level of government in African societies. And we'll see they draw from Twa principles. But the point is, Twa societies are small, they're hunter-gatherer, but they're family-based. Classless age-grade societies are larger. They're also family-based, and like the Twa, they have no kings and queens. Like the Twa, they have elders who preside over consensus decisions. And like the Twa, they have a male-female complementariness. For example, in my book, in looking at 14 ancient African family systems, one group I looked at was a Frikbo Igbo. The Igbo come from Nigeria and different parts of West Africa. Many of the Igbo people do not have kings. Some do. Many of them do not. A Frikbo Igbo, who also come from a classless age-grade society, they take the Twa principle of governance and they apply it to their systems. And in their societies, the male, the father, gives the last name to all male children. The mother's last name goes to all female children. This is called twin unilineal. In other words, there's two lines, each called unilineal, one line, but it's two, twin. And so what happens in the Frikbo Igbo society is the whole society is based on a male-female complementariness and balance, which has a Twa basis to it. And so among the Frikbo Igbo, the men build part of a house, the women build part of the house. The men have a place where they fish, the women have a place where they fish. The men are basket weavers, they weave a certain type of basket. The women are basket weavers, they weave a certain type of basket. So at every phase of a Frikbo Igbo society, what you see is an attempt to have a balance between male and female, which comes from this vision of the just society where all just males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Chancellor Williams makes the point that it's the classless age-grade societies that give birth to democracy. He's wrong about that. It was the Twa hunter-gatherer societies, but he's right to this extent that they were certainly the successors and the carriers of this tradition. So we need to understand something. Africans gave birth to democracy. See, if you look at Kemet, you're going to miss this because they had a royal system, a pharaonic system, where a person inherited their position by being born in a certain line, married to their sister. But we need to understand that African culture has this democracy thing to it, that the Twa gave birth to democracy without calling it that, just as they gave birth to religion without calling it that, just as they gave birth to a society in which you had this balance between males and females, but they didn't philosophize about that. They lived that. We need to understand that the African American, one of the keys to getting our act together, the African on the continent, is to understand that we need to empower our whole people. We're not going to be free as a people if we depend on a few charismatic leaders to free us. My book, The Art of Leadership, one of the things that I point out in this book is that The Art of Leadership, Volume 1, is that leaders in the best of African and African American leadership traditions are mouthpieces of the people. king, when he led the Montgomery bus boycott, he said, I didn't initiate it. When the people called on me, he said, I stepped forward as a spokesperson for the people. Malcolm X never compromised in his speech and in his actions. And in that sense, he was a spokesperson for black people. And so the Twa give birth to this. If we look at black classical music, we'll see that this is an aristocracy of democracy, where you have dukes and counts and queens, you understand, who get into a combo or a big band because they have great musical talent, but when they get to playing, they're improvising, and there's no government in charge because everyone's free to have their say-so. It's an aristocracy of democracy. It's a mixture of what comes later with the kingly, queenly systems, because we'll see that they were influenced by the Twa in that many kings and queens, particularly kings, were elected. And that leads to a phenomenon that's a contradiction in terms, royal democracy. Whereas in Europe, all you have is royalty, and they rule, and there's no check on it until they, finally, they have struggles between the emerging middle class in Britain, and they create a parliament and eventually make a figurehead king. But in Africa, the notion of the king being responsible to the people comes from this Twa base, this notion that males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. So what I'm explaining is, you have this evolution from the Twa to classless age-grade societies, to then larger societies that in some cases are kingly and queenly, and they are diverse. You can't say one thing about all African societies. They were diverse. But many follow a similar formula. After I got this vision, I was into a used bookstore, and I found this book on ancient African kingdoms, and here they describe a people in southern Africa called the Lozi, L-O-Z-I. And what do they say? In the Lozi kingdom, the king ruled the upper kingdom, the queen ruled the lower kingdom. Well, in some sense, this is like upper and lower Kemet. But I knew that the operative principle going on here was, this was a large society, the Lozi, and their empowerment was through a male king and a female queen mother. And the balance was each one ruling half the kingdom. But the king ruled the upper. That was an indication that this was patrifocal, because the upper meant a little higher. And the queen mother ruled the lower kingdom, a little lower. But fundamentally, there was an attempt to have balance. And societies where males and females were no longer ruling directly, then they had a king and queen mother. And they were representative of the males and females in society. And then they had a council. And that council at the national level was mirrored by a council at the regional level, at the district level, and at the village level. When you got to the village level, you found a king and queen mother, Asante, for example, in Ghana. And you would find that when the queen mother, she would nominate a candidate for kingship of the village, it would go to a council of males. But then when the decision was to be announced, all the males and females of the village came together, and the bravest and most eloquent male, young male, would stand up and say, my elders, what is your recommendation? The male-female principle, queen mother, the elder males. They give their recommendation. All the males and females in the village say yes or no, and it's consensus. So what you see here is, again, the Twa principle. We gave birth to democracy, not hypocrisy. The real, live thing. And so if they say Kwame is our candidate to be village king, and the people say, Kwame lied, Kwame stole, Kwame's this, Kwame's that, you'll hear hisses, hollers, and everything else. And what will happen is those elders and that queen mother will go back into a huddle, and they'll come up with another candidate until they come up with one that the people can approve, one that's just. Most of the time, they will make a just recommendation to begin with. But the point is, the people have the final say-so. So the Twa give birth to not only straight-out democracy, where there are no kings and queens, but they give birth to royal democracy in that they give a stamp to the fact that, in fact, in Africa, royalty doesn't mean the same thing it means in Europe. It doesn't just mean you got royal blood. Royalty means your family was among the families that founded the nation. That's what royalty means. And usually when they're selecting candidates, they'll select between families that founded nations, so it will rotate. So it's the most just one in a particular line. So it's a different concept of what a royal family is. And by the way, in Ghana, to show you how this works, when an Asantehene, who's a king, is nominated by the Queen Mother, the council elects one of her 3 candidates, because it's never known where they didn't. Then they take this king into seclusion and train him. And when he's trained, he comes back to be inaugurated. Before he's inaugurated, he takes an oath to obey the people's representatives, his council. Because in Ghana, and this is true in many African traditional systems, the king does not make a decision on his own. It's the consensus of the council that represents the people at the district, at the regional, and at the village level. Then, at the same time, the council takes an oath, and the people take an oath to follow the king, which means they're following themselves. Before the king takes office, he gives up all his wealth. And there's no army that he has. The army is a people's army. It's a militia. So he has no force to use against the people. It's characteristic of traditional African governments that traditional African governments, large as Ghana, did not need an army to control the people. But you do not know of one European government where they did not have an army to control the people. And this again is a Twa-based principle that the people are in charge. So you give them the weapons. So if this government is dishonest, the people will take them out. So it's beyond checks and balances. This is bigger than that. So what's my point here? The Twa lay the basis for family formation. And this is most important. The family formation, the balance between male and female in the family where they're equally empowered to govern every phase of society, gives rise to a different kind of family formation. It is the secret behind African democracy. And this family formation, for example, Yoruba, people in Nigeria. The Yoruba people, the last name of a child comes from the father. But the male child or the male inherits from the father's line. Female child inherits from the mother's line. So what this is telling you is there's a male-female balance even in inheritance. But the reason is male inherits what they're responsible for. In the Yoruba, they're an exception. The men are the farmers, so they inherit farmland. Most of the time, it's the woman who's the farmer. The female inherit the wealth of the marketplace because the woman runs the marketplace. So the man sells his own products because he says the woman's too good in business and she'll take advantage of it. Now, the Yoruba practice this governance principle the same way. They, in towns, oftentimes they'll have a council, and there's a council of Igboni. Igboni is a secret society. They maintain order. And then there's a council of females. Decisions are made by the consensus of the males and females. So what you're seeing is this balance in the Twa families plays up into family systems throughout Africa where men and women are empowered through their own lines of power. Now here's the point. In the world today, the people who are making progress, they're making progress based on using the best of their family systems, and those family systems are the model for how they govern their villages, their cities, and their nations. If you look at the Chinese, their family system is Confucianism. Confucius was an ancient Chinese philosopher. Confucianism isn't what most people think. It's not his philosophy. It was the traditional philosophy of China. By the way, the first two dynasties of China were African. They were black. Yeah, the Shang and Xia dynasties were both African dynasties. Renoko, Rashidi, and others, they're specialists in this area. The yin-yang philosophy of China is very similar to, because it's a masculine-feminine philosophy, sun-moon philosophy. It's very similar to this worldview that I'm describing that come from the Twa. And I haven't talked about the Dogon because the Dogon are really central to this worldview, and of Kemet. What we also see is that the Shang and Xia dynasty, they were run very much an African way. The emperor or the ruler was like an elder who was in charge of making sacrifices to the ancestors. He played the same kind of role that the kings play and the lineage heads play in Africa to this day. They practice divination, and the divination system is an African system. In fact, in Ethiopia, you wouldn't go to war unless you divined whether or not you'd win. And since the outcome of things like war are unknown, some people could say that's superstitious. But usually they would follow divination, which is they go to an oracle and find out if the oracle said you can win or lose, because they found it was accurate. And I'm a practitioner of the Yoruba system, and their oracle has always been accurate. I mean, I have never seen Odu Ifa, which is the divination system of the Yoruba, to ever be wrong. Never. It's absolutely right. By the way, all they read when they do an oracle in Odu Ifa, which is their system of divination, they're reading you. They're reading your destiny, which the Yoruba says in your head, your Ori. So you're getting all this profound wisdom, but if you had enough insight, you'd know it already. But the Babalawo, who is the father of mysteries, interesting, the Twa give birth to mysteries. Kemet has the highest mystery systems we know about, though I bet you the Twa are the highest. And then you have these priests who are fathers of mysteries. And what they're fathoming is your destiny, your life purpose. So if we look at the Twa, what we're seeing is that they are laying the foundation for global society. And through the Africans they give birth to, so you see the civilization of China. We know the first people in the Philippines are also Twa. What I didn't mention is that as the Twa in Ghana have been the initiatories people into healing. I had a student, it was about 4 years ago, and I was explaining how this Queen Mother in Ghana was initiated for 7 months in the forest by the little people. And she told me her grandmother was a healer, and the little people had trained her. Well, the first people in the Philippines are the Twa. They call them Negritos. They live in the forest and in the mountains. They're disrespected. And by the way, the Twa are disrespected in Africa because both Africans and Europeans regard them as backward because they live in the forest, because they're not interested in accumulating wealth, you know. So I said, what did your grandmother learn from these Twa? And she said, well, she doesn't know. Her grandmother died. I said, go ask your mother. She came back a few days later, and she said, well, the Twa taught her grandmother how to divine the future, the thing I was talking about. But she also said this, the Filipinos have a saying, never take your children to the river near the forest at dusk, because the little people will take them and they'll come back with extraordinary healing powers. The Twa are the initiators of the world into the higher wisdoms and into the higher truths. So in looking at family formation, it's important to understand that the success of a people in the world is tied to them following their family model. So the Chinese, it's Confucianism, and it's following the principle that the eldest male is in charge. China runs on that principle. If you look at the people who are governing China now, they're all in their 70s. Deng Xiaoping, who died recently, who was the architect of their economic transformation, 10% growth a year, died in his 90s, was in his 80s when he was the architect of what was going on in China, and while he was in charge of the military commission, held no official title. Didn't need to. He was the elder wise man. The military bowed to him, the political party bowed to him. This one man, 1,250,000,000 people, they're observing the wisdom of their elders. In this case, eldest male. I'm not saying we go that way. That's a Chinese way. But they're in power because of that. When you had the meltdown of the Southeast Asian economy just 6-8 months ago, China didn't melt down. Why? Because the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which the U.S. controls, the World Bank, they weren't dictating to them. One thing is they had not put their currency out to be manipulated, you know, on a world basis. But for another thing, they make their own internal economic decisions. If you look at the Japanese, they were bombed by the Americans during World War II, dropped 2 nuclear weapons on them.
Right.
But the fact is, they have the second strongest and the second largest economy in the world, even though they have no raw resources to back up that economy. What do they have? They have Japanese culture. And what's the heart of Japanese culture? It's Shintoism. What's Shintoism? It's venerating your ancestors. By the way, Japanese Shintoism is very much like Yorubaism, Asanteism. It's the same system, but it's just a Japanese style. By the way, the Anu people are the first people of Japan. They are also the pre-dynastic people of Kemet, Anu. Japanese have a saying, you know, Malcolm X used to quote this, that for a samurai to be good, he needed to have some black blood in him.
So the first people of Japan were black?
Yeah, black people. They're the first people all over the planet were black, though the 6 species of humanity is not found in America, you know. So what we see then is that the Chinese and Japanese making progress on their family system. If you look at the Americans and the Western Europeans, and for that matter, Eastern Europeans, they also have a culture. You'd be mistaken to call it capitalism or Marxism. Their culture, and it comes from their families. Cheikana Diop in his Northern Cradle theory best explains this. And what he shows is that, you know, they have a basically conflict-oriented warlike system where the strong rule, and particularly where the male rules. And so their family system is what I call arbitrary power. Comes straight out of Hesiod, what we were talking about before. So the ones who have the power rule, and they really dictate everything else. So what is the way for Africa? Africa is controlled by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Africans are trying to follow everybody's way but ours at the national level. We've got parliamentary democracy, you know. In Ghana, you've got justices who go to court in an African country where it's 100 degrees, wearing a white wig and black robes to look like they're in England, you know. Look foolish in England, but at least that's their tradition. It's got nothing to do with us. Or you have situations where in some countries, Ghana's an example, where the president has ultimate absolute power, where he can make war, enter into foreign policy, make trade agreements, disband his cabinet and his parliament. He has that ultimate authority. When you rest authority in the hands of one person, then it's very easy for a power structure that's global, that's all over the world, to get you to cave in. It's very easy. But when you rest it in a people, it's impossible. Because while you have some crooked people, I don't romanticize our people or anybody else. In the end, if the whole people have a say-so, such as in Ghana, should we let the foreigners own our gold? I know what the answer will be. No. And then the question will be, how can we all own it, as opposed to a few even of us owning it? So the thing is, the question is, what's our way? If the family way of the Chinese is Confucianism, of the Japanese is Shintoism, of the European it's arbitrary powerism, what's our way? And this is what the mother principles are addressing. And I think it's a fundamental value. And I'm telling you, this is absolutely sound. When you think about it, it's a way out for the sister on the street who ain't got no brother. It's the way out for Africans on the continent where the sister is out there hoeing the field and carrying the water and doing all the other hard work, and the brother's off somewhere trying to get money to pay school fees. It's the way out for the Caribbean, where the black man has also been marginalized and the load has been put on the sister to take care of the family. It's a way for Africans all over the world. What is this family model? It's simple. It fits us. It comes out of our culture. What I discovered when I looked at these 14 ancient and traditional family systems, I've only discussed a few of them, was that they followed a pattern. It was this trois pattern, and it was a pattern that comes out of twinness, the notion that where there's day, there's night, where there's left, there's right, where there's order, there's the potential for disorder. The things in the cosmos are always twin, as opposed to just one way. The Kemites said life is slow dying. To understand life, understand its twin side. It's death. The people who have the greatest appreciation of life in the Western world are often the people who have had a serious bout with death. it's a shame that that's the way you get to learn to appreciate life. I have a friend who was riding his bicycle one day. He's a European, and he fell into a hole. Deep hole, nearly died. Actually came out uninjured, but he should have nearly died. And so for a couple of years, he would close his office on Saturday. He would take his family different places. He realized he could have been gone. And the most important things in life was to enjoy his family. The most important things in life was to enjoy living and to do something for humanity. And so for a few years, he got this message. But the point is, that's because life is twin. Life is slow dying. So if we look at the model that the Twa have, the Twa were really basing their system on a twin male-female balance in the economy, in governance, in the way in which they transmitted knowledge on every level. And so when I looked at these family systems, I was finding family systems like the Afrikbo Igbo that I just talked about, twin unilineal, last name of the male going to the female line, female going to the female line. The Yoruba, male inherit from male, female inherit from female. The Swazi, which I haven't mentioned, queen mother, who's the elephant, the king, who's the lion. King, who's chief of the army, queen mother, who has the army headquartered in her palace, which is larger than the king's palace. King, who has the highest court, queen mother, who has the highest court of appeal. King, who's the rain, and the queen mother, the earth on which the rain falls. So what you see here is this male-female thing running through family systems, running through governance systems. It led me to conclude, I said, you know what? When you talk about our model, our way out, it's not matriarchy. It's not women ruling by themselves. It's wrong to say that most African families were matriarchal. And in fact, that's a label they stick on black women who usually don't have a man in the house. They'll say they're matriarchs. No, a matriarchal society is where women rule everybody, males and females, everybody. Black woman who's usually in that position is alone. That does not make it a matriarchy. Now, Africa had a few matriarchies. Societies ruled by women, but very few. And when I looked at our family systems, I said, they don't really fit patriarchy, which is a European and an Asian model, where men rule alone. And I said, matrilineal doesn't really describe what's going on either, because in many family situations, matrilineal means your last name comes from your mother. In many family situations, the woman keeps her last name, the man keeps his last name, right down to today. That's a common practice in Africa, you know. And then, you know, I thought, well, you know, if you look at the dowry systems in Africa, you have a system where someone gives up some wealth when they marry. In Asia, it's always the weaker party. In Europe, it's always the weaker party. It's the female's family. They give up dowry. That's why in China, they kill female children. Also in India, that's why they kill female children. If you got 5 girls, you ain't got enough money to give up for marrying all those 5. So instead, at birth, they practice infanticide, you know. But in Africa, I found this, and Diop was wrong on this, because Diop said the inferior party, the one joining the marriage, in other words, in Europe, the female who's joining the man's family, whose last name will be given to the children, her family gives dowry. But I found in every African family system I've studied, and I've studied many more since this book, in every one, the man's family paid dowry. And in 1 or 2, men and women paid dowry. But in most cases, it was the man, because, again, the twin principle was being confirmed, that the man's family was affirming the centrality of the woman as the life giver. The masculine was affirming the centrality of the feminine. So it was a balance going on. And also, if the last name came from the male, they were guaranteeing that if a divorce took place, the children would go to the male's family, because in Africa, the most important thing in marriage is children. You hear me? And for everybody, it should be children. Love's important, but those children are central. So again, I'm seeing this twin thing. You know, at every point I'm looking at it, this twin thing. And so I realized the African way is not the way of one side, only male ruling, or the other side, only female ruling. It's like Kwame Armah said in his book, 2000 Seasons. He said, the African way is reciprocity. It's balance. And so the term I've used to coin this, more important than the term is what it reflects, is not the matrilineal, the patrilineal, the matriarchy or the patriarchy, but the twin lineal. The African way is the twin lineal way. All that means is your lineage is the line you come from. You don't come from a father line alone or a mother line alone. You come from twin lines, mother and father.
Correct.
You don't come from a grandfather line alone or grandmother line alone. You come from twin lines, grandmother, grandfather. And if God is he, then God is she. I'm not saying God is. God may just be spirit. But if you're going to personalize and humanize God and make God one sex, you're going to have to make God the other sex. Because life cannot be brought into this world by one sex alone. So twin lineal simply reflects our way. It's our way. It's the way of balance. What does this have to do with us today? If you look at these trois, the trois through this balance of male and female constructed the basis for democracy. They constructed the basis for seeing that in African families, the woman was as important as the man because each one was an equal contributor. In fact, the woman contributed more because in the hunter-gatherer society, you're going to find rough food that you can pick more often than you are going to be able to hunt and capture game. So she was a more stable source of the food supply. But the point is, she was an important source. You don't abuse what's important. You know what I mean? Whereas in Europe, Diop points out in the Northern Cradle, the European woman was useless other than producing children, mainly male children, because they killed a lot of the female children. So the point is that not having a balance was key to one being abused by the other. But this balanced thing that comes out of a balanced worldview guaranteed that, as Diop said, there was in ancient Africa and in Kemet no systematic abuse or misuse of African women. If we're doing some of that today, it's because we have taken on what the Swahilis call the Wazungu or the white view and have begun to abuse and mistreat our women. And we do that. We have truly descended into a level of savagery. But the thing is, what this has to do with today is this. Just as the Chinese are making progress on Confucianism, and the Japanese are making progress on Shintoism, and the Americans and Europeans are making progress on will-to-powerism, we're only going to make progress when we apply to our lives that system that fits us. And we be a people that don't like hierarchy over us. We be a people that don't like people telling us what to do. We are a people that like to have a say-so in what we do. And given that, the model for our family, the one that can begin to be used to bring males back into the household, is this twin lineal model. You say, how does it work when a sister is running the household? Well, number one, the twin lineal model recognizes that inside the feminine is the masculine. Brothers will tell you when they're being raised by their mothers and sisters too, that she's both mother and father. So there's an interim period where that's going to happen. It's happening right now. Sister's doing a pretty good job. But what we need to do as brothers is help them out. And we need to be doing our rites of passage duties. We need to be coming in there and being extended fathers for these young boys and these young girls. We don't have to sleep with the ladies to do that unless they happen to be our sole and only girlfriend. Y'all get the point. Sole and only girlfriend. We need to recreate extended family communities. That doesn't cost any money. That's a question of us embracing our culture and going back to, as the rap artists say, black to the future, where elders were really respected in our community. But key to this is we have really got to see that if the male's going to have any future, the reason why males aren't in the family, that's since 1968, because up to 1968, 75% of our households had a man and woman in it, husband and wife, 75%. It's since 1968 that that's declined to 37%. And that pattern is all over the world, wherever Africans are. And you can write it off, because a lot of sisters say the reason is the black man is lazy. Well, some have become lazy because there's been a couple of generations where there's been no work. But the fact of the matter is we built this country. You really can't put the label lazy on either one of us. You know what I mean? But the thing is, Since the late 60s, you've had a transformation in the economy of this country where industrial work, I was reading the New York Times, that 500,000 jobs went outside the United States, industrial jobs, in just the last couple of months, you know? There was a study done between 1976 and 1982, and it showed that 720,000 black men lost their jobs between that time. And that same study showed that 720,000 black men were out of the household. There is a direct relationship between the man having a job and him being in the house. Because this is a society that says that if you cannot produce economically, you're not a man. And unfortunately, a lot of sisters believe it, and certainly a lot of brothers do. The fact is, if you want the man back into the house, we got to make him employable. And yeah, he needs skills. He needs to get back in school, all these things. But a key thing is, if there's no place where he can see an economic future for himself, he doesn't have much incentive to do that. And so one of the things we've got to see is this family unit coming from the Twa, spreading throughout Africa, and this is true of family units all over the world, is the first economic unit in a society. And the twin lineal model simply says that we've got to see the family unit as a love unit, as we do, but as an economic unit. And so we've got to start pooling money. Extended families. An extended family ain't just blood kin, it's friends, you know, and beginning to pool that money to build businesses in our community. Some of the rap artists are doing it. Some of our people are doing this. It's always been the case. We've had blacks with strong family traditions. But what we need to do now is to revitalize this. Bring this man back in. But the thing is, the man has got to understand that he's not the ruler, that there's going to be some equal governance going on in this family. And you know, the best black families have followed this principle. I was discussing this with my students and talking about the twin lineal model and asking them, how did it apply to their families? And one sister, she said, well, you know, in her house, because this is the beauty of this model, it's not arbitrary. There's not one way it works. You can be creative with it because you're talking about balance. So how does the balance work? It varies with each person, each family. So in her family, the father was the extrovert, the mother was the introvert. So what did they do? They built on the strengths that each one had with those qualities. The father was the one to go out in the world and set up a business. The mother was the one that helped interact with him on planning, kept the records, and banked the money. Typical of the black woman. The brother was the one who would organize the people in the family to work, but the mother laid out the work duties. You know what I mean? So this is a twin lineal model going on here. You know what I mean? Or I had a friend who used to be chair of Buffer, which is the local Oakland chapter of the Black United Front, Mr. Oscar Wright. He's in his middle 70s now. He's a multimillionaire. You never know. He lives in the heart of the black community. He's a builder. Owns real estate all over the United States. And when I was explaining this before the book was published, we had a retreat of the Black United Front in my house, and I was explaining the book. And so at lunch, Mr. Wright sat down and he says, oh yeah, I understand that. He said, this is the way it worked in my family. When we got married, we sat down at the table, and what we said was, you'd be in charge of what you're strong at, I'll be in charge of what I'm strong at. And what Mr. Wright was strong at was making money. And the fortunate thing is that they allowed that to go down. It's kind of like the way African decisions work. There was a line of power for women, line of power for men. The women's strength in Africa was agriculture. Men was hunting and gathering. Well, here it's based on what are your qualities? You know, what are your real strengths? So Mr. Wright had the ability to look at a piece of property and see future value in it and never sell it. That's his principle. He gets some property and it ain't never going outside the family, you know. And he's got property in Arizona, whole strip downtown. They wanted to buy it from him, downtown Founding Fathers. He wouldn't sell it. But he let his son from his first marriage acquire the property. He had to give him $30,000, but the property is worth $5 to $6 million. But he looked at him in the eye because he made him pay, so he'd be responsible. And he said, son, I don't sell my property. And the son said, I got the message, Dad. But the point is, in that household, the mother took care of raising the children. You know, the mother was the one that governed discipline and all the rest of that. But Mr. Wright was the one that went out there and accumulated property. Now the point is, in the best of our families, they're already applying this, because the way in which twin linealism has been translated by Africans in America has been through the institution. If you're looking at marriage, this isn't always the case. We're generalizing. It's millions of people, but often the case of the strong black male and the strong black female. What you'll generally find, contrary to the stereotype, most black families has got a situation where you got a woman who's every bit as strong as the man. And it's whether or not the man and woman can work that balance out that determines whether or not that marriage will work. And what will not work is the man trying to stomp over the woman and tell the woman what to do. And it's not advisable for the woman to do it either. And when that happens, marriages usually fall apart, because you're going against your model. So our way is the twin lineal way, where everybody has their say-so. That is, everybody who's responsible. In these families, it doesn't mean children have an equal say-so to adults. Now that's wrong. They don't bring in nothing. They can give advice, but they don't have no final say-so. They got to be responsible to do it. So I'm just saying that I think that when we're looking at the Twa and then tracing them throughout Africa, we see that today it offers us real solutions for the future of our people.
Marvelous. I would, there's several questions I want to ask you, but since we're on the Twa, I want to look at the Dogon, but I want to finish the Twa up and then go to the Dogon. How did the Egyptians look at and interrelate with the Twa? Is there any correlation between the systems and the principles, and especially those principles that are eternal with the Egyptians and the Twa?
Well, you know, the Kemites held the Twa in the highest regard. There's one account where a pharaoh sends an expedition into inner Africa, and the head of the expedition, who's representing the pharaoh, writes back, sends an emissary who tells the pharaoh that he has a Twa. They've have a Twa. And so the pharaoh sends back a message, and the message is that he desires to see this Twa more than all the wealth in his kingdom. That he wants to see the little ones who dance the dance of the gods. And that he held them in higher regard than anyone else. Protect them, bring them to my court so that I can see them. So what this is telling you is that the Kemites, who treated a lot of people who were not Kemetic as barbarians, held them in the highest regard. One reason is the Kemites said their origin was at the mountain of the moon. That is the origin of the Twa. The Twa, come into being near the mountain of the moon. The mountain of the moon is modern-day Mount Kilimanjaro, which is not in Kenya, it's in Tanzania. The oldest finds of hominids, of Homo sapiens sapiens, are the Twa. Many of them found there, as well as in Ethiopia, as well as in southern Africa, but most of them in East Africa. So the Kemites held the Twa in such high regards because they knew they were their first ancestors. The first ancestor in the Egyptian book of Coming Forth by the Day is Bes. And Bes is Twa. It's a little tiny pygmy, so-called pygmy. Europeans call them pygmies, but they're Twa. So they understood that these were the first ancestors. As I've noted already, the Twa had the highest ethical system on the planet. They don't just teach a high ethical system, they live the highest ethical system. So that they serve as certainly a model of Ma'at. The fact that the Twa established family economy for inner Africa, we know very little about the family economy of Kemet outside of the royal family. It's reasonable to surmise that since Kemet was an African civilization, it follows similar patterns, with men having certain responsibilities and women other. We know from Herodotus that, according to Herodotus, the female child in adulthood was responsible for caring for their parents in old age or in illness, which would indicate a matrifocal society, last name coming from the woman, consistent with the pharaonic society where the pharaoh's power came through royal females. So the Twa contribute that. In terms of technology, we know that the Twa say they tried civilization, but they didn't like it. Now, by civilization, they meant structures, architectural and others. So what contribution they made there, we don't know. But what we do know is that as the initiators into mystery systems, they are certainly the founders of that. And as the greatest healers, as I just pointed out some examples, they had to be at the foundation of medical science for Africa and for the world.
Now, when you say they are initiators into the mystery system, what are we talking about, and how do we know that they are the initiators into the mystery system?
I've just given you the examples, and this, I can cite books, but the Europeans who have traveled with the Twa, such as Colin Turnbull, Life Among the Pygmies, and others, they usually only see the surface. Every now and then they may see a little bit more. But the examples I give of the initiation of the greatest healer in Ghana by Twa, the healers in Indonesia, the Philippines by the Twa. Healing systems, I mean, if you can heal through telepathy, if you can heal through going through trances, and by the way, there are a number of cases of this in the United States where people have this ability to go into a trance. Their spirit diagnoses the illness. There's a guy named Edgar Casey, who's a European, who had the same talent, cured thousands of people. Western medical science is the only medical science in the world that doesn't combine the spiritual with the material side of medicine. The same is true with their philosophy. The same is true with their science. They don't have a sacred science. They just simply have a despiritualized science. But all the great breakthroughs in science have been made by the scientists who combine technical knowledge with a spiritual experience. Einstein's theory of relativity came from a dream, but he understood quantum physics. But it was the dream that enabled him to bring this whole truth together. The Twa people seem to be the people of the spirits. The Kemites said, the Pharaoh said, he wanted to see these little people who dance the dance of the gods. Telling you that these initiators are the closest to God. Their dance is the dance of the gods. It's almost like being in touch with God because they're the oldest ancestors. Being the oldest ancestors, they're in touch with the greatest wisdom in the world. It's hard for us to buy that now because we associate wisdom with writing, with universities and stuff like that. But all universities start within, the universe within. And so, the Twa lay that foundation.
Then, some of the things that you have mentioned in terms of the Twa being able to communicate through mental telepathy, I'm just trying to get a picture of an ancient people and change the view that Europeans have given us of primitive people, because they would have you believe that primitive people did not have any real wisdom, and they did not have great technology or great insight into the sciences and the arts. I'm just trying to look at what their world was or could have been, in the sense that if you can communicate through mental telepathy, you are so close spiritually to oneness with nature. And if you have oneness with nature, there is no limit to what you can do.
Yeah, as I started off by quoting Dr. Abenga when he said Western philosophy and science is based on hypotheses, but African philosophy and culture and science is real and it's accurate. And that's because Africans combined the technical with the spiritual. They understood they were linked. They understood that a blade of grass or an ocean or river of water had spirit in it, had life in it. It's a source of life, but it has spirit in it. And consequently, we were able to do many accurate things in the area of science or architecture because we had technical mastery, but we understood that you wouldn't really understand the truth of an aspect of science unless you also had the spiritual understanding. So an Einstein doesn't get the theory of relativity with his logical mind alone. You need the logical mind, but there has to be some kind of spiritual intervention. That's true of all the breakthroughs in science. They've all had an intuitive basis to it. Einstein's theory of relativity came from a dream, but his conclusion